Just want to welcome you all to the Solutions Initiative 2024, Charting a Brighter Future. I know it's been a slow news week, so we're glad to be here to give you something interesting to read. Otherwise, you might be bored. Obviously, it's monumental that President Biden has stepped down and endorsed his vice president to take over his job. It's been a little weird week for me, too, because I have 4 vice presidents at the Peterson Foundation, and in the last 48 hours, each one of them has come into my office and tried to convince me I can't beat my opponent, the national debt. And I don't know what to make of this, but, and obviously, Kamala Harris seems to have secured the nomination, and I know the big open question is who's she going to pick? And I know everyone in this room is on the edge of their seat waiting for the big announcement of who her OMB director will be. And I'm sure we can even have a question on the panel about that if you want. Anyway, in all seriousness, I know everyone's very busy, so we very much appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. And let me make just a few remarks before we get the panel going. First of all, and most importantly, I want to express my sincere appreciation to all of the Solutions Initiative participants. As many of you know who work on this issue, fiscal responsibility can be a lonely business. Most people want to avoid it, especially politicians, and stay out of it entirely. But all 7 of these organizations made the tough choices. They faced the music and made the difficult decisions to stabilize the debt over the long haul. So we're very grateful for their participation. As you may know, the Peterson Foundation publishes hundreds of charts on these issues. Most of them are very doom and gloom and scary and negative, but the Solutions Initiative ends up producing what is my favorite chart and our most optimistic chart, and we'll just put it up here. I'm sure we'll talk more about it. But this is debt as a share of GDP under current law over the long haul as the baseline up top, and these are the 7 Solutions Initiative plans. And they all stabilize debt and put it on a downward path. So we're very proud of these results and, again, very grateful for their participation. I just want to review a couple of the stats and results from it. All 7 agree that we're on an unsustainable path. As you can see, no one thinks what we're doing now makes any sense. All 7 reduce debt to GDP by 1/3 or more over the long term, so very meaningful reductions. All 7 look across the entire budget comprehensively, so there were no sacred cows in this project. All 7 reduce interest costs over 30 years by $13 trillion or more, so it made a huge difference on the interest cost savings. All 7 reform the tax code responsibly, which is particularly important as we look to next year. So there's some good ideas on how to do that in a balanced fashion. And all 7 extend the solvency of Social Security by at least 30 years. So they really responded to the charge. So congratulations to all of them, and thank them again. As I look at this long-term chart, I'm reminded of my dad, and many of you knew him. He worked on this issue for a very long time. And it started with a speech he gave on Reaganomics in the 80s, and he first realized this very predictable crisis, this unsustainable path of our fiscal trajectory driven by demographics. So he wrote several books on the subject, and he was right. And he spent more than 30 years working on this before he passed in 2018, and I've now spent 15 years actually working on it, which is hard to believe. So the question really for everybody in this room is how many more years are we going to ignore this visible, important problem? And we have 7 prominent think tanks that have spoken up and said what they suggest we should do. There's a lot of you in the audience who have influence in Washington, and we're all counting on all of you to try to make some progress in 2025. As you know, there's several fiscal events happening next year, which we think can be action-forcing. We've got the debt limit, of course. We've got the expirations of the TCJA, the discretionary spending caps, and the ACA subsidies. So those are all happening and represent, we think, opportunities to do the right thing and improve our fiscal outlook. I think there's a lot at stake here, and what we struggle with is that most voters typically don't connect the national debt to issues they care about, right? They understand it, they're a little worried about it, but they don't really understand why it affects them or why it affects the issues they care about. And so I think it's important for all of us who are in a position to communicate around the world and around the country about the connection between the debt and the real issues that they may think about more on a daily basis. So if you care about climate change, this path will leave us with fewer resources to deal with the effects of climate change or to have for the investments in climate change that we need to prevent it. If you care about poverty, this is a terrible anti-poverty strategy because it will only mean more trillions on interest and less resources available for those programs. And many of us are becoming more and more concerned about our democracy. right? And the Peterson Foundation has actually started work a bit on this issue. What does it say about democracy if the world's most advanced democracy can't even manage its finances, right? That's not a good impression to leave the rest of the world on how democracy functions. So the debt might not be front and center in every dinner conversation, but it's lingering behind every single topic that's going to be an important part of this campaign. So we hope that you and we and all of us can inject these issues. The best part of this challenging issue is that it's solvable for two reasons. First, this is entirely within our control. We don't need another country to agree on this. We can do it ourselves whenever we want, so that's something good to keep in mind. And number two, we know what to do. And thanks in part to the Solutions Initiative and other initiatives we've done over the years, and many of you have worked on, there are many blueprints out there, there are many options available. So we can do this, and we know what to do. It's just a matter of getting the will behind it. So as my dad used to say, the long term gets here before you know it. And unfortunately, we've kind of arrived at that point when we're at $12 trillion of interest over the next 10 years. We're at a point that I think he feared. But there's still time to get it done, and we hope 2025 will be a good opportunity. I want to bring out Jeff Holland, our Vice President of Research, who's going to talk to each of the 7 participants, and they're going to present their views. And so enjoy the show. Thank you for being here and being a part of this. Jeff Holland.
Thank you, Michael. I am Jeff Holland, the Vice President of Research at the Foundation. I think that everyone on the stage would agree with the headline in the Washington Post editorial today that said, "It's necessary to tame the national debt and surprisingly doable." As Michael noted, the Solutions Initiative presents hundreds of potential policy combinations that would improve our fiscal situation. And there are a number of areas of agreement among organizations with varied ideologies. Today, we want to delve into those areas of overlap, as well as identify approaches where more work needs to be done to achieve consensus. We'd also like to hear your questions, so please use the note cards on your chairs to pass questions to our teams who will come through the center aisles to pick them up. To get started, each organization will have 2 or 3 minutes to give their overview of their own plan and highlight their top 3 priorities. We'll go in alphabetical order by organization, starting with Jordan Herring from the American Action Forum.
Thank you, and thank you all for having me. I'm going to begin. I would be remiss without acknowledging the work that AAF President Doug Holtz-Aiken, as well as my predecessor at the forum, Gordon Gray, did regarding this plan. So our plan is based on the assumption that the United States is running out of time to stave off a debt crisis. And the onset of such a crisis would make it difficult for us to fulfill our obligations, both domestic and foreign. So significant fiscal consolidation is needed, and our plan believes that both revenue and spending should be on the table. So through a series of revenue and spending changes, our plan reduces debt to 95% of GDP by the end of 2034, compared to 122% as projected under current law. And over the long term, it would reduce debt further to 67% of GDP by the end of 2054, compared to 166% under current law. And our plan would run modest annual budget deficits. So our plan focuses on 3 key areas: entitlement reform, addressing global threats, and tax reform. So in that first bucket of entitlement reform, we look at mandatory spending, which currently comprises about 60% of the budget, and 75% of mandatory spending goes to spending on Social Security and major healthcare programs. So that's Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, and the ACA exchanges. So some of the reforms that we include in our plan, for Social Security, we would raise the normal retirement age. We would increase the taxable maximum so that 90% of earnings are subject to the payroll tax. We would means test benefits for high-income beneficiaries. We would adopt progressive price indexing, and we would use the chain CPI for the annual cost of living adjustment. On the Medicare front, we would eliminate the 0.9% additional Medicare surtax, and we would adopt a premium support model to give Medicare beneficiaries subsidies to purchase private insurance. And then on the Medicaid front, we would cap federal spending per enrollee. And then addressing global threats, so we take the discretionary baseline that assumes the statutory caps enacted in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and we do include a defense increase on top of that to ensure that the United States has sufficient resources to stave off any threats from our adversaries. But on the flip side, we do include some non-defense savers, such as repealing the Davis-Bacon Act and some reforms to constrain federal spending on civilian and military health care costs. And then the third bucket is tax reform. So obviously the expiration of the TCJA is going to be a big action forcing moment over in the next year. So we would allow the reduced individual rate structure to expire and return to the pre-TCJA level. We would repeal the individual alternative minimum tax. We would repeal the 20% pass-through deduction, and we would instead impose a maximum cap rate of 25% for pass-through business income, and we would repeal the net investment income tax. On the corporate front, we would maintain the 21% statutory corporate rate. We would repeal the corporate alternative minimum tax, and we would make some changes to some international tax provisions. And lastly, we also include a $20 per metric ton carbon tax that would be indexed annually to inflation plus 5%. All of that's to say, again, as I mentioned at the outset, that would reduce debt to GDP by 67% by the end of 2054, and we would run a modest budget deficit of 0.4% of GDP in that year. Thank you.
Thanks, Jordan. Next, we'll hear from Jim Capretta from the American Enterprise Institute.
Thank you. Thank you to the Peterson Foundation for, again, taking a leadership role in this initiative, which I think is very valuable. Look, we are really at an important point in our fiscal history where some of these challenges that have been festering for a long time really need to be addressed in a pretty bold way. So our plan, again, this time, takes a couple of major policy points and then goes with many details below that. First being that the major problem is entitlements, that there needs to be very substantial reforms of these big programs, especially Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Those three are the three most important programs in the federal budget. On the spending side, they all need reforms. I'll talk about that in a second. On taxes, our view is basically that we really should be pursuing tax reform, pro-growth tax reform. The problem in the fiscal situation is not raising more and more revenue, but really getting at what's an affordable level of revenue, and then how do you fit the programs that we want to prioritize within the available revenue. And then lastly, we do believe we also should increase defense given the current security situation around the world. Now, on the entitlements, there's too much to talk about in 2 minutes, so I'll just hit a couple of highlights. First, we really believe there should be more competition and market incentives in the big programs, especially Medicare. Secondly, in Medicaid, there's lots of games going on in Medicaid that a lot of the public doesn't know about in terms of who's paying for what. We would move to a per capita system at the federal level so that it would be very clear this is how much you're getting from the federal government, and the matching component at the state level would be less consequential, which is really where a lot of the problems are today. And then with Social Security, a very bold reform. It is a plan to move toward a fixed, flat benefit that everybody would get that would be tied to a much lower level of median income, on top of which there would be personal accounts through employers for most people, if not through them, through a new system set up like the Thrift Savings Plan, where at the beginning 3 percentage points of their earnings, instead of going to the payroll tax, would go into these accounts. This would be a very long transition. This would start initially for people entering the workforce. So it would take a long time for this to transition, but the end point would be, much more funded personal system that is completely regulated by the government with a flat benefit that everybody would get to protect any elderly person from falling into poverty. There's so much more to talk about, but maybe we'll get to that in the Q&A.
We'll get to it, Jim. Don't worry. Thank you. So next is Andrew Lautz from the Bipartisan Policy Center.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it. And appreciate Peterson organizing this latest edition of the Solutions Initiative, all the great work you do on behalf of responsible budgeting. First off, I want to congratulate Ben Ritz at Progressive Policy Institute for reducing debt the most. I heard that if we had tied, they would have made us arm wrestle, and I haven't been to the gym in a while, so it's easier to finish in a close second. Second, I want to acknowledge the entire team at BBC who helped put this together: Jason Fichtner, Bill Hoagland, Shia Kappas, Rachel Snyderman, Emerson Sprick. This was truly a team effort at BBC. Now to our blueprint. We reduced debt held by the public from 99% of GDP at present day to 59% by 2054. That's a 40 percentage point reduction. We do it with a fairly equal mix of revenue increases and spending cuts. 22 trillion in revenues when excluding the effects of immigration and macroeconomic feedback, and then 18 trillion in spending cuts when excluding the effects of immigration reform and net interest. So about a 55 to 45 revenue to spending mix. And true to our brand at BPC, we landed right in the middle of our 6 peer organizations on both revenue as a percent of GDP and spending as a percent of GDP in the 30th year of the budget window for a small surplus in 2054. Our top 3 recommendations were first paying for TCJA extension. Before we think about reducing debt and deficits, we need to address the $5 trillion elephant in the room, which is next year's tax cut expirations. And if you go beyond the campaign rhetoric of both parties, members of both parties will support extending significant portions of those tax cuts next year. And so we would prefer that the parties agree to agree on this and start figuring out how to pay for next year's expiring tax cuts. What we do at BPC is extend some of the lower rates, the doubled standard deduction, the double child tax credit. We extend some of the offsets and revenue raisers included in TCJA, and we go beyond that, for example, by repealing the state and local tax deduction. BPC's recommendations solely within what I call the TCJA universe come out to roughly revenue neutral. It's about $275 billion over 10 years, which is not perfect, but is a lot better than the $5 trillion question that lawmakers are facing next year. Second, we go beyond TCJA and do more comprehensive tax reform. And so if you think about broadening the tax base, we repeal the income and payroll tax exclusion for fringe benefits. We repeal step up in basis, which I know several of our peer organizations do. We're looking at changes that can both reduce deficits and debt and allow us to simplify other parts of the code. For example, we get rid of both the individual and the corporate AMT in our plan. And last but certainly not least, we strengthen Social Security. Trust fund insolvency is looming. Benefits are continuing to outpace income for the program, and Social Security is undoubtedly going to be one of the greatest challenges that Congress faces in the years ahead. BPC's blueprint is adopted from our 2016 Bipartisan Commission on Retirement Security and Personal Savings, and it would gradually increase the full retirement age, index cost of living adjustments to a more appropriate price index, gradually increase the payroll tax, increase the taxable maximum, and actually enhance benefits for some low-income seniors. So it is a balanced package within Social Security reform of shoring up the program for the long term. So those are our top 3 recommendations. There's a lot more to discuss. Thank you, Jeff.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Next, we'll move to Cap and Brendan Duke.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'd like to thank the Peterson Foundation for inviting CAP to participate in this project. It was a lot of fun. So at CAP, we don't think our debt trajectory is sustainable. Having a debt to GDP ratio shooting toward infinity with mounting interest costs for households and businesses is not the future we want. It's not the future anyone wants. At the same time, we don't think that there's a specific level of a debt to GDP ratio that presents a problem. So our goal was to slow down that growth rate. So it began falling and we achieved it. So we stabilized the debt to GDP ratio at 118% of GDP. We achieve a primary budget surplus toward the end of the 30-year budget window and keep real net interest below the 2% benchmark identified by Jason Furman and Larry Summers. At the same time, we think that this sort of fiscal responsibility is really consistent with a progressive policy agenda that we lay out. So the 3 things that we try to do here are first, raising non-defense discretionary spending. This funds some of the government's most critical priorities. It helps fill some of the holes in our poorest safety net, such as nutrition, housing, and healthcare. It funds the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Commerce Department staff who tell the Federal Reserve what the inflation rate is and what the unemployment rate is. And it funds R&D and infrastructure investments that will power American growth through the 21st century. The second thing we propose is investing in people. We think the last 3 years have shown the results that we can achieve in smart public investments. They're delivering a strong, equitable labor market recovery in the short term while boosting productivity in the long term. So the CAP plan makes a similar investment in the American people. We deliver affordable childcare to millions of families, universal pre-K, free community college, paid leave, a larger and more inclusive child tax credit, unemployment insurance reform, and more. Third, the question is, how do we pay for this? How do we do this while stabilizing the debt to GDP ratio? We do this by raising $9 trillion of additional revenue over the first 10 years, largely from the wealthy and corporations, by raising the corporate tax rate, adopting a billionaire minimum income tax, lifting the cap on Social Security, taxable earnings, and more. The U.S. despite all of this, would remain a low-tax nation. We would move from the 29th highest tax country in the OECD to the 28th highest tax country. We think that sort of trade-off is worth it while achieving our fiscal sustainability goals. So thank you.
Thank you very much to the Peterson Foundation. It's just an honor to be a part of this. And I would also like to give a huge thanks to EPI's chief economist, Josh Bivens. This is his work. I fully endorse it, but I can take zero credit for what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, but just so you know how we're thinking about this exercise, our plan is an aspirational budget for a progressive governing majority. And we really take seriously the point that how you shrink the deficit is at least as important as how much you shrink the deficit. So our view is that the US economy has generated highly unequal growth for decades, and our system of social insurance and income supports is uniquely stingy among rich countries in the world. Our international peers have chosen to increase the share of national income that they spend on public goods and social protections and to finance it with taxes, while in the US, federal revenues as a share of GDP are still where they were 70 years ago. So all of this leads us to believe that the way to get to smaller deficits in a way that protects the most vulnerable and sees the biggest increases in social welfare is to really lean on long overdue revenue increases. So our revenue increases come in two buckets. The first is just highly progressive revenue sources, increased taxes on capital incomes and wealth, higher top ordinary rates. And then the second bucket of revenue increases is actually not about increased demand on fiscal resources. It's about making fiscal resources more transparent. We eliminate nearly all tax expenditures. So that's revenue. Our key spending priorities are a fully universal and public health care system, a better UI system, and key investments in the care economy. Okay, even though our plan is, as I said, aspirational, its broad principles are still really useful in helping us think through current policy debates. So in the near term, our key policy priorities are maximize the revenue we gain from the expiration of TCJA provisions, and actually get on the table even provisions that are not currently scheduled to expire. There is a chance to get revenue out of this, and we should not squander it. So that's one. Two, Social Security. Every year that we allow the taxable maximum of Social Security to be below a huge amount of income of the rich is a year that we have allowed unforeseen increases in inequality to degrade one of this country's most important programs. So I would say that sort of simple principles of maintenance and repair say that we should have bipartisan consensus to raise the taxable maximum back to where it covers 90% of wage income, the way the architects of the early 1980s reform clearly intended. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is a key thing in our plan is that theoretically has bipartisan support in Congress is getting more savings from prescription drug benefits in Medicare by further toughening provisions for bargaining with pharmaceutical companies. It's an important fiscal issue, it's doable, and if there isn't really bipartisan support, I think that bluff kind of needs to be called. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Heidi. Okay, next we will move to Brian with Brian Riedel from the Manhattan Institute.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Peterson Foundation, for hosting this. At the Manhattan Institute, putting this together, my goal was to stabilize the debt at 100% of GDP in a way that could be both good public policy, but also plausibly bipartisan if lawmakers ever magically commit to stabilizing the debt. Medicare and Social Security face a 30-year shortfall of $124 trillion. Let's start there. Social Security. The goal for Social Security is to move us towards annual balance between revenues and spending, not just do 75-year solvency by pairing decades of surpluses with decades of shortfalls. Also, to save the taxes for the larger Medicare and interest costs. So on Social Security, we first raised the eligibility age to 69, gradually over the next couple decades. We also set a minimum benefit of 125% of the poverty rate. But For middle and high earners, we have a series of Social Security reforms that, when you put them all together, basically lead to a stable benefit of about $24,000 per retiree that will grow by inflation from that point. Should be affordable. To cushion the blow, the Social Security payroll tax would end at age 62. And by 2054, Social Security is an annual balance. On Medicare, Medicare would be converted to a premium support system in which seniors choose among private health plans, offering a benefit at least as generous as the current Medicare system. Seniors selecting more expensive health plans would pay the extra cost out of pocket, while those choosing plans that are less expensive get a rebate. CBO estimates that, as insurers compete for your business, the cost to both seniors and the federal government would drop by 7% without reducing benefits. Together, actually, additionally, our plan would raise Medicare premiums for middle and high earning seniors, but not for the bottom 40%. Together, with a 1% payroll tax hike, we cut Medicare's 2054 shortfall from 3.6% of GDP to 1.8% of GDP, which is about the best I think we can do. Yet, still got to raise taxes. Can't get there on spending alone. We raised 2.3% of GDP in taxes by 2054 without significantly damaging the economy. The TCJA gets extended, except the top rate goes back up to 39.6, and the 20% deduction for pass-through business income, gone. We cap itemized deductions at 15% of their value, while capital gains would finally be taxed at death. Corporations would lose some of their deductions. The IRA energy credits would be repealed. Also, you'll love me for this, the IRS would be fully funded to collect unpaid taxes. Ducks. Still, some broad-based taxes must also rise. The tax exclusion for employer-provided health insurance would be capped at half of the average, or that's right, at the 50 percentile of the average premium. The Medicare payroll tax combined would rise by 1 percentage point. The gas tax goes up 15 cents per gallon, while a modest carbon tax would be rebated to at least the bottom half of earners, but not to the top half. Ultimately, we stabilize the debt at 100% of GDP, and then over time produce such a growth in interest-saving dividends that the debt actually starts to fall.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thanks to the Peterson Foundation for organizing this event, and as others have said, all of the great work you do to support fiscally responsible budgeting. And I also want to thank my team at the Progressive Policy Institute for all the help they put into this budget blueprint. It wasn't just our fantastic budget team, but really all of PPI's policy experts who contributed to it. So we have, I think, 6 dozen some recommendations in our report, and I could go list all of the policies, but you'd be here forever, so it's in here. And we have an even longer version on our website. But I want to talk about the values that went into PPI's budget. President Biden has this great quote that I take inspiration from, and that's, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value. We wanted to craft a budget that reflected our values, and so you see that, as Andrew said, we had the lowest debt to GDP ratio by the end of the window. Our budget actually was on a path to balance within 20 years and then achieve growing surpluses afterwards. Now, why did we do this? I think everybody here knows that you don't actually have to have a balanced budget to have a sustainable fiscal policy. There are 2 reasons for it. The first is our budget, like Heidi's, is very aspirational, and we knew that not all of this stuff is going to happen. So we designed it to be both a vision and a menu of options. But the second reason is that we wanted to build fiscal space for future generations to have more control of the budget. We wanted to reduce the cost of interest payments, which are snuffing out critical public investments in our future, and instead give future policymakers the room to address challenges that might arise. So something that I think is very interesting about our plan is that in addition to having the lowest debt ratio, we also have the highest discretionary spending level of any group here. And we're showing that we can build fiscal space, we can make big public investments in education, infrastructure, and scientific research while still having a responsible fiscal policy. Our plan aims to achieve many of the same goals as President Biden's Build Back Better agenda that I think we all know most of it didn't get done. We were pretty critical of some of the elements for budget gimmicks and not being well targeted, but we believe in those values and we wanted to show how they could be accomplished in a fiscally responsible way. And we have really ambitious tax and entitlement reforms in here. So we don't quite move to a flat benefit structure the way Jim's group does, but we move somewhat there. Instead of basing benefits on earnings as the current system does and giving higher benefits to folks who have higher incomes, our system would award benefits based on how many years you work. So it's still an earned benefit, but it is more progressive than the current structure. We make reforms to Medicare to make it more efficient, to promote competition, and our plan would actually, because we focus so much on healthcare savings, we would reduce the cost to the government without increasing the cost to the average beneficiary. I think there are a lot of hard choices that went into our blueprint, but I think we're very proud of the outcome here. It reflects our values, and I'm looking forward to talking more about some of the specifics that went into that.
Well, thanks, Ben, and thanks, everyone. I know that's a lot to digest, 7 plans with lots of different areas of focus. So let's see if we can narrow it down a little bit and talk about some of the areas of consensus. But let's start with the big picture first. So a couple of you mentioned your debt to GDP ratio, and so Ben, I'll start with you because you ended up with the lowest. Were you targeting a 50% or so debt to GDP ratio, or were you in competition with everyone else to be the lowest, or how'd you end up there?
All right, so 2 things I want to say. First, it's not a competition, and second of all, we did win. We weren't aiming for a specific debt to GDP ratio. We have, I would agree with Brendan. We don't think there's a magic debt to GDP ratio. Ideally, I think 100% debt to GDP has, and the historical high of 106%, I think that has some psychological significance, some historical significance, but really it's about the trajectory. And so we want debt to be going on a downward path. Our goal, though, we did have a goal of putting the budget on a path to balance, and for the reasons I said in our introduction, we wanted to number one, overshoot, because being an aspirational plan, we know that this isn't going to get adopted next year, no matter who wins. We know it's probably never all going to happen. We'd be lucky if part of it happened. So if you adopted half of the savings in our blueprint, that would be enough to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio. But we wanted to show that it is, in fact, possible to do a budget that reflects our values and is fiscally sustainable and build in space for future generations to be able to address the challenges they need, rather than committing all those resources now and leaving the future policymakers to have a challenge. I guess last thing I'll say is, in the words of our, the new Democratic presidential nominee, we wanted the future that can be to be unburdened by what has been.
All right. So on the other end of the spectrum, so Brendan, you sort of mentioned when you were describing your plan that you were going for stability, but you ended up over today's level of around 100% of GDP 30 years from now, so you ended up around 118%.
Sure.
What was sort of the theory behind your thinking?
Sure. So now I wish I had a coconut joke I could make, but unfortunately I don't. So, as said, we don't think there's any magical level when it comes to the debt to GDP ratio. Ben Ritz and Jason Furman and Larry Summers all say no one knows the benefits and costs of different levels, 75% of GDP, 100% of GDP, or even 150% of GDP. So, we don't know so we didn't target a specific level. What we cared about was that stability. We just wanted, we cared a lot more about the slope than the intercept, so to speak. And so as said, we had primary surpluses for the end of the budget window, and we kept real net interest below 2%, as identified by Furman and Summers. So we did this without cutting anyone's traditional Medicare benefits. We expanded Medicaid, and we didn't cut anybody's Social Security benefits. We did this with a large increase in non-defense discretionary spending and enacted a progressive care agenda. We could have pursued more aggressive deficit reduction. We could have toned down our increase in non-defense discretionary spending, enacted other tax increases, or, like other organizations did, cut Social Security and Medicare benefits. But we felt that hitting an arbitrary debt to GDP target wasn't worth doing those things. If there's some new evidence showing that the level should be lower. There are plenty of other cranks we could turn to get there. So, and let me say, I'm happy to bet against anyone on this stage that the US debt to GDP ratio will probably exceed 118% at some point over the next 30 years, given policymakers' lack of interest on the subject. So, that's kind of where it is.
Well, okay. Hopefully that is not going to be the case, but we'll see. All right. So diving into some of the details. So there were a lot of areas of agreement, and I think some of the expiring provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the individual provisions that are expiring, was an area where at least everyone addressed them within their plans, in some way addressing the tax rates, the deductions, the standard deduction, the personal exemptions, things like that. And no one has a path of revenues to GDP that's lower than the CBO's baseline, which assumes that those tax provisions expire. So that means that you're offsetting in some way or another. So I think, Andrew, you actually brought this up in your talk. Could you discuss a little bit more about sort of how you thought about those expiring provisions and what you did to offset them, the cost?
Sure. Well, so again, to emphasize the point I made at the top, this is the elephant in the room. Before we as a country, before Congress can really think about debt and deficit reduction, it has to confront these major expirations, and I do. As a member of the Bipartisan Policy Center, I do get a little frustrated seeing the two parties talking past each other on this tax bill. It's to some it's a tax scam, to some it's the best thing since sliced bread, and we know that they are probably going to agree on somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 to $5 trillion of tax cuts. And so where we approach this, at BPC and thinking through, again, not necessarily a BPC endorsement of this is exactly what should be done on every single expiring provision next year, but where do we think the two parties might be able to agree based on their rhetoric right now, based on historical experience, such as with the expiring Bush tax cuts over a decade ago. And so we, surmised, and our plan includes extending lower rates for the bottom three brackets, partial protection from taxes going back up for the fourth bracket, and allowing the top three brackets, those rates to go back up. We also we do extend the doubled standard deduction. I think there's value in that policy, not only from a tax simplicity perspective, right, in terms of reducing the number of people who are itemizing, reducing the number of hours people are spending filing their taxes, but also it can be a progressive benefit when designed correctly. It provides a disproportionately larger tax benefit for low and middle income taxpayers than it does high income taxpayers. And so that comes with a trade-off, and the trade-off is limiting itemized deductions. So we fully repeal SALT on the way to paying for that doubled standard deduction. We trade off the permanent repeal of personal exemptions with both some of those lower rates that I mentioned and with an expansion to the child tax credit. And so, I think obviously the members and staff on the tax writing committees and on the budget committees understand this, but I think the rank and file in Congress are just starting to understand that all of these pieces move together. And so it really is, it's going to be a lot more complicated than just the expiration of the Bush tax cuts over 10 years ago, which were mostly on the revenue cutting side. There are offsets to consider in here, and we approached it from a perspective of if there's divided government next year, where could we see the two parties coming together, not only choosing what to extend, but how to pay for it responsibly.
So Jim, I think AEI had the lowest path of revenues to GDP going forward, but it still means that you had to have done something to offset or to address somehow in the TCJ expirations. What elements of the TCJ did you like the best, and how did you think about the upcoming expirations?
Well, we looked at it mostly as, first of all, let me say that the plan was put together by 4 people, not just me. I just want to make sure I neglected to mention Joseph Antos, Andrew Biggs, and Alex Brill. And Alex is our tax person. And the philosophy he brought and we all brought to it was, let's think about this as tax reform, pro-growth tax reform, because without a growing economy, if we have just sort of a mediocre mid-growth economy, that's not going to cut it with all of these fiscal challenges. So you need to have both responsible fiscal policy and policies that really promote dynamic growth over the long run. That, to us, means cleaning up the tax code so that it's got the lowest possible rates for the revenue target you want to hit, and getting rid of lots of unnecessary expenditures, deductions. So if you read through the details of our plan, there's hardly any special interest that is not going to be unhappy. You know, the mortgage interest is gone, the state and local deduction is gone, there's a cap on the tax preference for employer-paid health insurance, there's all kinds of business deductions that would be eliminated. So to get the rates as low as possible, we get rid of a lot of clutter in the tax code. In terms of how we view the TCJA, I mean, in general, there's a lot of people that say they did get the business side of it in a better place than it was prior to passage of the law, mainly because many of the incentives were to move capital and investment overseas. A lot of that then came back. Plus, they did expensing that allowed a lot more direct investment in the U.S. economy, and capital expenditures did go up. So I'm not saying it paid for itself, but it was definitely pro-growth on the business side.
So it sounds like you're essentially in favor of extending the current TCJA, but offsetting that with the elimination of tax expenditures?
Not exactly just extending the TCJA.
Is that too simplistic?
It's a little bit too simple. That's okay. I mean, it's a complicated topic. I mean, we go down to 4 individual rates. They lowered the rate from 21 to 20 on the corporate side. And if in terms of how it would look going forward, there's a lot of things would have to change to get to those rates. You'd have to get rid of a lot of the tax expenditure side of the budget to make it work. And we do, and we propose that in the plan.
So Brian, you mentioned the pass-through exemptions, which is something that maybe is often pointed to as something the TCJA did not get right. Do you want to elaborate since you brought it up on that? And then I'm curious how other people see those pass-through exemptions.
Sure. I think I found most of I try to approach my plan less aspirational. I think aspirational plans have their place, but more of if both parties were locked in a room and told you're not leaving until you get the debt to 100% of GDP over 30 years, what would be a decent bipartisan, halfway competent plan that they could come up with? So it's not my dream plan. It's what would be a decent plan that would be plausible. And I started from the reality that the TCJA is going to be extended for the vast majority. That was basically part of my baseline. It's the reality of where Congress is right now. But the pass-through deduction, it was one that I couldn't fully justify. I think there has been a lot of good research on how it has functioned more as a windfall for certain small businesses rather than one that has actually promoted investment in business formation as much as we want. It does not really create as much of an it is not fixing as much of a disadvantage with the corporate code as is commonly believed. I think that ultimately we can help small businesses, but I think just chopping off 20% right there has just not proven to be effective. It's proven to be difficult to really enforce well, and there's all sorts of issues with how you define income. I get what they're getting at. I just didn't think it was the best way to help small business.
Any dissenting or affirming views?
I'm retweeting that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think we all agree.
Right.
All right, well, we can move on then. Well, here, rapid fire. So corporate tax rate is not expiring, but a number of you chose to modify it within your plans. So rapid fire, where's your ideal statutory corporate tax rate?
All right, I'm going to channel my inner Doug, and I'm going to say 0%.
Oh, okay, but that's not what's in your plan.
No, we didn't touch the corporate rate at all.
We did 20.
BPC's plan has 21%, same rate.
We did 30%.
35, the pre-TCJA rate.
21.
25%, but we soften it with full expensing.
All right, so a bit of variation there. Let's talk about some other revenue policies. So the net investment income tax, there were 3 who advocated for repeal, 3 who advocated for expanding it, and 1 who, Brian, you didn't address it at all. So anybody want to speak up for their approach to the NIIT? Heidi?
I cannot speak to our approach to the NIIT, so I will defer to somebody else. Yeah.
We did repeal it, but it's in part of the revenue neutral system, right? So that in some ways it's made up for with the other provisions of the package. I mean, as part of we've added so many different components to the tax law, layering on different rates for this purpose in this bill. And our approach really was to get to 4 rates for the individual side that were predictable, and that's all there is, and 1 rate on the corporate side, and eliminate most of the add-ons that have been accumulated over the last 3 decades. So it's really a tax simplification and reform plan. And getting rid of the NIT was part of the simplification.
What we did at BPC was we expanded the base of the NIT to cover more types of pass-through income, and I think there's a strong intellectual justification to consider repealing or significantly reforming the NIT. But if and I think you outlined the case well. But what our justification was, if it's going to stick around, the base shouldn't be like Swiss cheese. It shouldn't have holes in it, which is why we advocated for an expansion to the base.
We're NIT fans. So we think, like BPC, we expand the base of it. Don't think, active business owners should get a tax break that wage earners or passive investors don't get. And we expanded to 5% as laid out in the Biden-Harris budget, and redirect the revenue to the Medicare Trust Fund. For us, income is income, and we don't like opening up, a difference between wages and passive income. So that was our approach there. We think it makes a lot of sense. Don't want to blow up the Gingrich-Edwards loophole any further.
Let me ask you about one other revenue provision, then we'll move over to the other side of the budget. So when we did this 5 years ago, 6 out of 7 organizations chose to impose a carbon tax. I think, Brian, you were the only one who didn't, and you said you didn't think it was politically feasible. So that's essentially 7 out of 7. But this time...
Uncle. I cried uncle.
No, that's okay. So you did it this time. But 2 others did it. 2 others who did do it last time didn't do it this time. So CAP and BPC both omitted carbon tax from this year's plan.
Sure, I can speak to us. So first, let's recognize that we just enacted the largest climate package in American history. I'm not a climate person, but all the nerds who do emissions modeling say it will do a ton to bring down US emissions. Our reason for not including it is really boring. Last time it was deficit neutral, that we raised revenue and rebated it back. In the fiscal exercise we were doing, that didn't do much, and we were already hitting our fiscal targets. So, we didn't include it, which, again, I think it's pretty boring that we just didn't decide to add then subtract.
So I'll add, so similar to Brendan, like we were very satisfied with where we landed on revenue to GDP, and so the additional revenue of a carbon tax wasn't necessary for both the debt stabilization that we wanted to achieve and for the balance between spending and revenue that we wanted to achieve in our plan. I'll also add that just in consultation with our energy team at BPC, I think the bipartisan path forward on a carbon tax has, in our view, gotten more challenging in the last 5 years, not less challenging, and maybe that will change 5 years from now, but that was some of the justification for why we didn't include it this time around.
All right, well, thanks. Let's move over to the spending side of the budget then. So everyone also addressed Social Security in some way. There was a fair amount of agreement across the various organizations. Everyone prevented depletion over the period that we were talking about, 30 years. And everyone addressed benefits, although in a variety of ways. So a few of you suggested imposing a minimum benefit. Some of you mentioned this in your introductory statements. So I think for the AEI, Manhattan, BPC, and CAP all included a minimum benefit. Did I miss anybody there? And then 4 of you also endorsed raising the retirement age. So AAF, BPC, again, Manhattan, and PPI. So for those of you who advocate raising the retirement age, what would you raise the retirement age to?
We'd raise it to 70.
We raised it to 69, 1 month every 1 month increase every 2 years.
We raised it to 69 for the regular by 2037 and 64 for the early age.
We indexed it to reflect longevity, but we preserved a special early retirement age for low-income workers.
Thanks. So, and a number of you also advocate raising revenues, again, in some different ways, but that would apply to Social Security. So I think, Heidi, this was part of EPI's plan, as well as increasing the cap was part of EPI's plan, along with AAF, BPC, and CAP. So some bipartisanship there. What was the approach that you all took?
It just is that this was the 90%, so the cap so that it covers 90% of wage income, what was intended by the early 1980s reform of Social Security, because they did not foresee the big increase in inequality that meant so much more of rich people's income is then over the cap. So this would just be actually kind of maintenance of the intended thing that happened in the early 1980s.
Does anyone else want to talk about their approach to raising revenues dedicated to Social Security? Ben?
Well, I'll talk about ours because I think it was like completely in the other direction. Our plan actually got rid of the payroll tax entirely, which I think is if you're looking at something that's very aspirational on our budget, that's definitely up there. Going back to kind of the principles of tax simplification, we have the income tax, we have the payroll tax, 15% up to a certain amount of wages, and then much lower rate above that. And it was meant to ostensibly finance benefits for Social Security, but it hasn't kept up with the cost of benefits. I think it's going to be very difficult, unless Congress is going to act next year, it's going to be very difficult to maintain that historical link between the payroll tax and benefits. And so if it's already struggling to keep up with that structure, why have this complicated regressive tax when we can just streamline the income tax system, look at other possible sources of revenue? And so that's why we took a very different approach to Social Security revenue than I think everybody else here did.
So Jordan, it was a little surprising to see AAF on the revenue-raising side. What was your thought about? What were your thoughts about that particular element?
I unfortunately was not involved in the methodology of that. That's all Doug and Gordon, so I can't unfortunately speak to that.
All right, well, we'll blame it on them then.
Yes.
So for Medicare as well, all of you addressed policies that would have made the HI trust fund solvent over the period as well. But this time there were definitely there's more divergence of approach in the way you were treating the Medicare program. Some sort of working within the strictures of the way the program is set up now, others advocating for sort of totally different approaches. So for those of you who are advocating for something different, like a premium support program, can you sort of elaborate on your thinking behind that?
I guess I'll jump in on this. First of all, I'm not sure I would describe it as being a total break with the way the current program is run, right? There's already bidding in the program from the private plans. There's already premiums, in a sense, set based on those bids. The question is really how to do it in a standardized way so everybody's bidding on the same package, and also including the fee-for-service program in some way that would be fair and allow it to transition into it. There's lots of contention now that Medicare Advantage plans are overpaid. I think what we need to do is figure out who's really running the most efficient plans, and the way to do that is through premium support, actually. People forget that the Congressional Budget Office did model this and look at it, and if you do it right, you could save about 7 or 8% on total Medicare spending, according to CBO, and that would be, not an insignificant amount of money. So there's much to be saved here. Plus, I think the potential is for even more if you could do it and design it right, and also would take care of a lot of this contention that's really in play at the moment about what is the role of Medicare Advantage. And I think if you can prove and show that they are actually, who's actually less expensive in which regions of the country, I think it would help the program get to a better place politically as well.
Anyone else want to discuss their plans for Medicare?
One thing I want to say, so you said there's a divergence of approaches to this, and actually I think there's been more of a consensus this time. In 2019, when we did this project, we had things that looked more like single payer, and we had I think more on the benefit cutting side, and we proposed something that was consolidating Medicare Parts A, B, and D into a more streamlined benefit structure that we called Medicare One. and trying to simplify the program that way. And this time, I think 4 groups did something like that. I think a lot of people made the system more streamlined. And I think actually there's kind of I'm not going to say that everybody here agrees on Medicare, because certainly that's not the case, but I actually think there's less disagreement now than there was 5 years ago.
I need to say one more thing. I got to make sure I make this plug, which is on average with premium support, the beneficiaries actually save money too. It's true that if you go into individual markets, there may be some markets where the fee-for-service is, someone in fee-for-service pays more to stay in a program because it's more expensive than the other options. But overall, even CBO concluded that the beneficiaries, if you design it right, would actually, on average, lower their premiums for enrollment in Medicare. So this is sort of a win-win scenario if you design it right. And I think that's sort of where we need to go, because I don't think these private plans are going away. The question is how to harness their role in a way that drives down costs for everybody.
Any other thoughts on that? A few of you mentioned site-neutral payments. So, Jim, you all include that as well, Andrew and Ben. Andrew, you want to talk a little bit about what your proposal is?
Sure. So a lot of our proposals within Medicare build off the excellent work of BPC's health program and some of the recommendations that they put together based on a bipartisan group of experts and a lot of consultation last year. And so on the site-neutral front, we implement site-neutral payment policies for hospital outpatient departments and that are commonly performed in hospital outpatient department services commonly performed in the physician setting, and we had those estimated savings at between $100 and $200 billion over 10 years. So it's a meaningful difference in the Medicare program, and it's part of a package of reforms that also include, as Jim was talking about, taking a look at Medicare Advantage and how it's competing against traditional Medicare. And making some improvements in the program.
On moving to Medicaid, a number of you had talked about sort of putting per enrollee caps on or things like that. How would that work? For those of you who proposed it, how would that work under your proposal?
Well, for those of you, many of you know already that Medicaid is currently financed with a matching system where the federal government the states spend money, and then the federal government will pay for a portion of each dollar of the state expenditure. And so it's on average about 65%. Medicaid is a big program, right? So there's lots going on in here. But part of the fundamental challenge in the last 30 years, 40 years, has been that the state share is subject to a lot of manipulation, mainly because they can actually essentially tax a provider, get the revenue, use that to draw down federal money, and then pay the provider back with higher reimbursements. This cycle has gotten to such a degree that it's a little bit hard to tell who's paying for what, and the incentives on the state side are not very good. So to get to a better incentive structure where they know there's going to be a fixed dollar per enrollee, a per capita dollar amount would make more sense. You could get rid of these rules around the state share. They would only get this much per enrollee, and it would be calculated based on, you could, as always, be a political formula. But another point to make here is that the Medicaid has got a lot of different subpopulations. There's people who are dual eligible, very sick elderly people. There are disabled people. There are people on the program that are very low cost, but they still need subsidies to basically get health insurance. You'd have different per capita levels for each of these populations, which would vary quite substantially.
And I think PPI had also addressed some of the advantage taking that's going on in the Medicaid program.
Yeah, so our approach to Medicaid was basically budget neutral. We did not want to be in a position of cutting Medicaid given the population it serves, but we wanted to be more efficient about it. So one of the biggest problems with the matching formula right now is that states will increase payments to providers, tax those providers to get the money back, but then tell the federal government that, hey, we spent more on Medicaid, so that means you have to match us more. And so We wanted to take reforms to crack down on some of those gimmicks, make the reimbursement structure more transparent and make the program work better. But we saw that more as a way to improve Medicaid rather than trying to balance the budget on the back of Medicaid, because that's something that PPI definitely does not support.
One other policy that's coming up for discussion at the end of next year are the enhanced subsidies for purchase of insurance in the marketplaces. And so those enhanced subsidies would expire. Did any of you choose to address that within your plans?
We extended them, made them permanent for almost 30 years, I guess, depending 2025. I'm not gonna do the math, but we made them permanent and also addressed the Medicaid coverage gap.
Heidi, were you nodding as well?
Yes, but we just addressed this by having a fully universal and public healthcare system. But it's a needed reform short of that.
We partially extended them. I think so in 2019, we proposed to fix the ACA cash cliff that caused people to lose benefits by just earning a little bit too much and leaving a gap for people who are kind of middle to upper middle income in insurance coverage. But I think the ARP-ACA expansion was larger than was necessary, and also it's targeting all that spending just on the exchange population and not benefiting all the folks who aren't on the exchanges. And so we wanted to permanently fix that cash cliff and do a little bit of an expansion relative to the original ACA policy, but that was a little more fiscally responsible and better targeted than what was done in ARP and IRA.
So let me remind you all that you have cards on your documents here, so that you should feel free to ask questions. So if you have questions, please write them down and pass them sort of towards the aisle, and someone will come around and pick them up as we continue the conversation here. So moving on to discretionary spending, we didn't ask you necessarily to divide between defense and non-defense, but a number of you did, or you addressed it in the memos that you wrote as part of the document. And Joy, I think we were talking beforehand that you all included an increase in defense spending as well.
We did. So we took the current discretionary baseline that incorporates the statutory caps on the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and we incorporated a defense increase that totals $1.7 trillion over 30 years to ensure that the United States has the proper resources that it needs to respond to any threats from adversaries. The increase is kind of front-loaded, so it's $980 billion in the first decade, and then it tapers off to lesser amounts. But we did that again just to ensure that the U.S. has what it needs.
Did anyone else consider defense spending separately?
We did. I'm not a national security person, but to keep faith with the folks in AEI who are adamant that the strategic environment has shifted very substantially in the last decade, and are pressing their audiences to increase defense. Our plan goes from roughly 3% of GDP on defense to 3.5% within a fairly short time, keeps it there for a while, and then eventually phases it down, assuming the environment improves again, which may not be the case. But in any event, we do increase defense, and then we just basically assume on the non-defense side that it's at baseline levels. I think our basic view is that the problem in the fiscal outlook is not non-defense discretionary. Of course, there are ways to save money there, but most of what will be saved will be spent on something else in non-defense discretionary that might be underfunded now. So that's not the pot of money that really needs to focus. We really need to focus on the entitlement programs.
Ben, did I see you nodding?
Yeah, so our approach to defense was, I think we agree that the strategic environment for defense has shifted. I mean, anybody who's been watching what's been going on in Europe and Asia, I think, can see that. And so we think there is definitely a place for new military spending now that there wasn't when we did this exercise 5 years ago. At the same time, there's a ton of waste in the Defense Department. It's not the driver of our debt. We know that that's mostly the imbalance between mandatory spending and revenue, but there are savings within the Defense Department that can be used to help offset those increased security needs. So our proposal is to start from a perspective of trying to offset that new spending with savings internally to defense. If there is additional spending that we need above that level, our blueprint creates more than enough fiscal space to meet that need, and we think that, if you look at the cost of something like Ukraine aid, it's pennies compared to the cost of doing nothing, and potentially greater military conflicts down the line. But we think it makes sense to start with trying to do things, trying to spend smarter before we try spending just more or less.
Do any of you think in terms of imposing caps, either on defense or non-defense or both, as you were creating your plans? Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I did a report on caps recently, and it showed that over the last 44 years, we've had caps for 22 years and no caps for 22 years. In the capped years, discretionary spending grows by 2.7% per year. In the uncapped years, it grows by 6.4%. So we capped it for 30 years at 3.5% growth. 3.5% will probably, I hear from a lot of conservatives, be too permissive, too easy. But what we've learned from caps is that when you make them unrealistically tight, Congress dismisses the caps and increases spending 10 or 15% in a year. So you want the caps to be tight, but realistic, so that they'll actually hold to it and not get rid of it. 3.5% works because nominal GDP is going to grow by about 3.8% per year over the next 30 years. So if caps are growing at 3.5%, you're still reducing discretionary spending as a share of GDP, while hopefully making room for defense, veterans costs that are skyrocketing, and other domestic needs. Our other thought on this for not going tighter than a 3.5% cap is I didn't want to create a situation where the American people are accepting social spending getting totally gutted just to pay for senior citizens. I think ultimately that's not sustainable. So I tried to be a little more aggressive on Social Security and Medicare and a little more realistic about funding for kids and social programs than gutting it.
Andrew, you
Yeah, no, we also included caps on both the defense and non-defense discretionary side. I think Brian raises some good points about the political constraints you face when caps are too tight. Ours are on the tighter side than what Brian proposed. We have a 1% cap on both defense and non-defense for the first 10 years, and then a 2% cap thereafter. Now, there's a lot of levers you could push or pull within there. And what we do from under those caps, we kind of have a sub-menu of defense and non-defense options. We wanted to do our homework a little bit and not just, say, hey, we're going to, put a cap on it in Congress. You have to do, all the hard work. We put a few options out there. And, back to your earlier question, Jeff, on defense spending and how we're thinking about it. There was some internal division on this because we are thinking about, the national security landscape, how dramatically it's changed even in just the last couple of years. But I think Ben raised some good points on how you can think about what is not currently working in the defense budget and how that relieves some, if you address those programs, those aspects of the defense budget that are not working, it gives you some space to address the emerging threats and crises we're facing. So we look at troubled, expensive, and in some cases troubled next generation programs from which, for which there are plausible, current, present day alternatives like the F-35 program, the Future Vertical Lift, naval ship construction. Can you sort of slow the rate of growth in naval ship construction over time? And we try to focus on those sort of new programs rather than personnel or existing programs. And we also, in looking at our defense options, we tried to for lack of a better term, spread the pain among the branches so that you weren't focusing too much on the Air Force or the Army or the Navy.
In EPI's plan, you included a lot of investments that often might be done through the non-defense discretionary budget. Can you talk a little bit about the type of investments you think are important, how you would determine whether that was sort of money effectively spent?
Yeah. Yes. Well, now all I can think of, Brendan and I were talking about the need for increased BLS funding, and he mentioned now that's all I can think about. But that is not what I was going to say. I was going to say, I think the biggest unfinished business from the recent round of industrial policy bills is big investments in care infrastructure. Availability of care and care workers is absolutely essential to maximizing our labor force participation and to just having a strong and resilient economy. So in our plan, We do universal early childcare, universal pre-K. We also make large investments in home and community-based services, and that's essentially elder care and care for people with disabilities. We also do paid family and medical leave and universal, I've said this before, but universal and fully funded or fully public health care. We also do big grants for K through 12 to make big investments in schools and education. So those are sort of the care and kind of care adjacent kind of investments that we make. We also raise infrastructure spending above what was in the bipartisan infrastructure law, and we also increase non-defense discretionary spending because, as you said, a lot of current public investment happens there. Like, that's where the Highway Trust Fund is. That's where EPA grants for clean school buses are. Like, that's where a bunch of key stuff is. And the way we think about determining effectiveness is, of course, to think about what will be the impacts on economic growth and what will be the impact on like long-run fiscal trade-offs. But we also take very seriously when there are welfare gains to things that don't mechanically show up in GDP measures or fiscal measures. And so that's like the lens that we use. And so to just give some examples of how that plays out, like the labor force participation boosting effects of the CARE agenda, that has a big impact on economic growth. Some investments like pre-K, they actually have such a high fiscal rate of return that in the long run, they're deficit reducing. That long run is very long run, right? Like, we're talking 15 plus years out, but that's money on the table that we should definitely be taking. Infrastructure investments, particularly in cleaner production, that has human welfare benefits that are not fully captured by GDP or by fiscal measures, but that we definitely want to take very seriously. So those are the kinds of things we're looking at and the kinds of ways we're thinking about how we think about their effectiveness.
And is that similar to the way any of the rest of you thought about public investment, or is it radically different? Sorry, Ben.
Yeah, so to our budget caps conversation, PPI's blueprint actually has 3 different discretionary budget caps. We have defense, we have general non-defense, but then we also wanted to separate out those public investments that generate long-term growth. Investments in education, infrastructure, and scientific research. We thought that those investments should grow with GDP because we should be spending a consistent share of our national income investing in the future. It's not right that we when we have tight discretionary spending caps, we've been gutting our public investments in the future. One really important stat on this, I think, is the Bipartisan CHIPS and Sciences Act was supposed to have a big increase in spending for R&D. And then when it came time to appropriate it, the increase for the agencies that were supposed to be doing that research didn't actually materialize. They got less money than they did beforehand. And so I think it's really important that as we're looking at the discretionary budget, we're making sure to preserve space for those critical public investments.
Anyone else?
We do a lot of what EPI does, not quite as much. It's like what you would have expected, but especially those care investments, HCBS, childcare, pre-K, paid leave, all that stuff. So.
Just the baseline on non-defense has gone up quite a bit in the last few years, and our proposal basically would leave it there and not take a lot of money out of it, but at the same time say that there are things that probably need more investment, but the discretionary part of the budget also requires some level of reform. Some of these agencies really haven't been modernized in a way that most of the private economy has been, and so there needs to be better incentives, I think, in the federal apparatus to invest in modernization of services for the public, some downsizing where appropriate, and then investment in the stuff that really will pay off.
Thanks. Let me ask one more question now to get to this stack of questions we got from the audience. So student loans has been in the news a lot with lots of forgiveness and a lot of questions about the cost of that. A few of you addressed student loans in some fashion within your plans. Would anybody like to discuss their approach?
So CAP's plan adopts there's a weird baseline thing with when we did this whole project because there's a new student debt relief plan, but we adopt the one that was struck down by the Supreme Court, presumably legislatively. But I think we can speak to in some ways we did a baseline adjustment to take into account that the administration now has put forward a new one, which we don't quite know how much it costs, but we incorporate that. I think what's great about it in our budgets contest is that it also includes those higher education investments, so it stops the problem from growing worse at the same time.
I guess, so I think we're probably one of the most vocal center-left opponents of all the student debt cancellation. I think for the most part it's pretty regressive. It's not right to ask the majority of the country that doesn't go to college and has a lower average income than college attendees to be paying off the debt of the people who get the income benefits from it. One thing I think President Biden was absolutely right about was focusing on income-driven repayment programs, trying to have the amount you pay back be based on your income so that if you get the income benefits of a college degree, you use that to pay back your debt. And if you're stuck with the debt without getting that income benefit, then the cost of that is mitigated. But the program that President Biden did, I think, was far too generous. It would make debt the norm for financing higher education. The median college graduate, if they took out the maximum loan, would not even have to repay the full balance of it. And so we did more IDR relative to the pre-Biden baseline, but we did something that was, I think, better targeted than what the SAFE plan ultimately ended up being.
And I'll just add on our front, we took a pretty comprehensive approach to kind of the mix of higher ed programs and incentives, and just a hat tip to my colleague Tristan Stein, who's our Associate Director of Higher Education, and helped us kind of think through these moving pieces. So we eliminate subsidized federal student loans, we eliminate the American Opportunity Tax Credit and the Lifetime Learning Tax Credit, but we also increase Pell Grants, and we provide a state matching grant essentially for investments in higher education. And I was actually just redoing the math earlier today, and we come out to it's about a budget neutral plan over 10 years. It increases deficits, I think, about $16 billion over 10 years. So roughly deficit neutral in the scheme of things, and it's I would call it a rationalization of kind of the existing mix of higher education incentives right now.
Heidi, were you gonna say
I was just going to double click on this, the importance of making college affordable. And so we have the kinds of things you were talking about, but and you were talking about too, but we have grants to states to make their state university tuition lower. That's key things like that are the flip side of student loans that we need to keep top of mind.
All right, so here's a question from the audience. So what is one policy option you think deserves more attention, maybe from the lens of voters or the public? Jordan, anything that springs to mind?
I would say, come back to me. Let me think about it.
All right, anyone want to tackle that one? Heidi?
I'll go. I think automatic stabilizers need way more attention, right? We need to have things in place to make sure that we are recession ready. Right now, we handled the COVID recession really well, but there were many times in recent decades where that was not the case, and we really suffered for a long time as a result of it. So in our plan, we do UI reform that is all about automatic stabilization. Strongly progressive taxes are also an automatic stabilizer. And the way to think about that is if you have a swath of people whose income goes down because of a recession, they drop into a lower tax bracket. And so that means their spending won't be offset one for one when there's a recession. So that is also a key thing. But I think it is super important that we keep automatic stabilizers at the forefront when we think about our budget going forward.
Jim?
I have one, which is in our Social Security plan, there's an emphasis, Andrew Biggs put this together, on moving at least an element into a personal account system. President Bush proposed this back in 2005. If it had been done at that point, many lower income Americans who would have spent the last 20 years with a little bit of their Social Security going into an account system would have built up a pretty good amount of savings, far in excess of the rate of return within Social Security. And you can do this in a way where people have to understand that they say, well, it's going to, you have to borrow the money because it's not going to be the pay-as-you-go system. But over a long period of time, you're essentially financing this system with a higher rate of return personal investment system with some guardrails around it, and people will build more assets and wealth. I think, there's a lot of scare tactics around it, it's privatization, but frankly, people would be a lot better off over the long run if some element of the plan went into a savings-based system.
So there are a couple of questions about political viability of the plans. I know a number of you addressed this, your plans as aspirational, but is there any sense that compromise could be achieved? What do you think would be most conducive to passing your plans into law? Like what sort of political change would be necessary to really move forward?
Yeah, I'll jump into that because, again, I kind of emphasized that I was trying to go for the political plausible, both parties locked in a room. I think right now, having worked on this issue in Washington for 23 years, written 600 reports, toured the country in speeches, done millions of interviews, nobody cares. People in this room notwithstanding, it is so hard to get people to pay attention to this stuff. And when they do pay attention, they all have their simple solution. If you just do this little thing that I already think we should be doing, the problem magically goes away. Unfortunately, I think the prospects for a bipartisan deal on this stuff are very slim. And I work with Congress. I talk to lawmakers every day. I think the prospects are very slim for a deal until something happens. And by something happening, something happens to the economy. Something happens to the bond market. Something happens with interest rates. Then things start to spiral quickly. Interest rates start to move, financial markets move. Then the two things that they do in Congress is nothing and then panic. They'll go from doing nothing to panicking. And my hope is when you get to that point, they pull off the shelf the 7 proposals here. And then they put themselves in a room and come out with something. But the reality is, and I cannot emphasize this enough, neither Republicans nor Democrats are politically strong enough to do this themselves. I don't care if you have a unified Republican government or a unified Democratic government. Anyone who tries to do this on a partisan basis, all tax or all spending, there is going to be such a backlash, you're going to get demolished, and then the other side is just going to come in and repeal it. So really, both sides are going to need to hold hands and jump together, which means when they do solve this, everybody's going to hate it. And if everybody hates it, they probably did something right.
So I'll second everything Brian said, and obviously given our mission and mandate at Bipartisan Policy Center, this was central to every consideration we made in this blueprint. I do not to layer on to the pessimism, because I actually do agree with Brian's optimistic part of your take, where hopefully if and when a crisis does happen and they are locked in a room, they are pulling from these 7 plans and they're pulling ideas from them. But there have been recent historical examples of bipartisan cooperation, many recent examples of bipartisan cooperation not making the debt and deficit problem better, but making it worse. And so when I think about TCJA extension next year, the expiring tax cuts, I worry. I'm even more worried almost that they don't offset it, that they don't try to solve this $5 trillion math problem. I'm almost more worried that they make it worse, right? That the bipartisan agreement, if there's divided government, becomes, we can't agree to pay for this, but I want my $500 billion in additional tax cuts, and you want your $500 billion in additional tax cuts, and let's make this a $6 trillion plan. That's a very real possibility, and so the political incentives are not aligned right now, but hopefully when the moment arrives, these plans will be of use.
Yeah, clearly we are worried about this as well. But the idea behind this, of course, was to show that there are areas of agreement on both left, right, center, and as well as the center, and that, yes, hopefully there is a way forward. Is a fiscal commission that way forward?
I don't think a fiscal commission is a cure-all, but I do think it's a great option to get the conversation going, right? For a couple of reasons. One is, I know a lot of folks point to the 2010, 2011 era, Simpson-Bowles, and the super committee and the failures there. And that was a long time ago in Washington timeline. There's a whole generation of staffers and policymakers that weren't in Washington when that last happened. And so I think that exercise could be useful for the country in thinking about how significant these challenges and these problems are. And then second is it's good for, if your measure of success for a fiscal commission is there's going to be a $5 or $7 or $10 trillion bipartisan debt reduction plan, you are guaranteed to be disappointed. But if your measure of success is we're going to have a robust menu of options that both parties put out there and can draw from when there are future crises or issues that come up, or when Social Security and Medicare solvency come up in the 2030s. Like, if that is your measure of success, then a fiscal commission can absolutely be successful.
There were a couple of questions about whether we should do things comprehensively or incrementally. So thanks, Andrew. I think you sort of touched on that. There are also some questions about immigration policy, which was a part of 4 of the plans here, but we haven't really talked about it. So the question is actually specifically, given workforce demands when baby boom generation reaches peak demand for long-term care services, why no increase in legal immigration levels? Ben?
So I think there's a really strong argument for increasing legal immigration. I mean, we know that obviously there were some border challenges over the last year, and we want to crack down on where there's national security implications. But for the most part, legal immigration is really good for our country. In the presidential debate, Donald Trump said immigrants are bankrupting Social Security and taking all these benefits. Completely wrong. Immigrants are a net positive to Social Security. They pay more in than they take out. And even the old immigrants are taking our jobs line isn't remotely true anymore, if it ever was. There are more job openings in the United States now than there are unemployed workers seeking to fill them. So, if they're taking jobs that there aren't even enough Americans left to fill, I think that's just a completely wrong argument, and we really need to be looking at immigrants as a solution for, at least a partial solution for, our demographic and labor force challenges.
Jim?
Yeah, we didn't put it in our plan, but that was really just out of neglect. It's not something that is front and center in the 4 of our portfolios. And so I think all of us were in agreement once we saw that the others proposed it, said this is definitely something that should be done. But the important point on this is really that the fiscal policy, the fiscal problem is associated with the ratio of how many people are drawing benefits versus how many people are paying taxes and working. And the need is going to be quite substantial because the working age population has really stagnated. Without immigration, it's not going to grow at all, really. And so we need to get this question right, and it's always been part of our culture and our country. I think this debate over the last 10 years has gotten way, as these comments are already totally, I agree with, way off about what the reality is. And so, unfortunately, we need political leadership to start making the point that this is going to be a huge benefit and a strength for the country, not the opposite.
I just have one other quick thing, plus one to all of that. It is, and the empirical evidence show increasing immigration is really positive for at the federal level fiscally, a total positive. That's not necessarily true at the state level. And so thinking about immigration reform, where there are also some grants to states to help potentially offset any fiscal impact at the state level, could be a really important part of comprehensive immigration reform.
Okay, one more question for everyone, and I'll ask it in both the positive and the negative way. Now that you've heard everyone describe their plans and some of their key components, what is one policy that you wish you had chosen that someone else has mentioned? The negative way, which I also got a question on, is what policy do you dislike the most in your or another plan? You can choose to answer whichever way you want. Ben, why don't we start with you? We'll come down this way.
Oh, do you have to? I'll say one thing that we put a lot of thought into our plan, so I don't want to say that there's necessarily any, I mean, I think we weighed everything that we saw the other groups doing, and we were very deliberate about our choices. I'll say one policy that other groups had that even though we didn't have in our plan, I think is good policy, and that's limiting the exclusion for employer-sponsored health insurance. I think that's an important part of capping the subsidy, the open-ended subsidy that's going to healthcare expenses. The reason we didn't include that in our plan is because we have a different approach where we would actually impose a cap on all out-of-network prices at a ratio of Medicare prices to really try to bend the cost curve down, and the savings from that accumulate as a reduction in the cost of the employer-sponsored insurance exclusion. And so to do both of those felt like double dipping to us, and so we didn't do that, but I think it's good tax policy, and frankly, it's probably more realistic than our very aspirational approach to healthcare.
Brian?
I'll jump in. So this wasn't asked, but I'll say my favorite proposal in my plan is killing farm subsidies, because they have virtually no redeeming value, and I want my headstone to someday say killed farm subsidies, if nothing else. The policy that I wanted to put in mind but didn't was immigration reform, because I agree with the policy arguments. I was worried that if I put it in mine with a lot of key audiences, they would completely tune out and wouldn't even listen to the rest of the plan. There are certain policies you have to put in or the numbers don't work, and then there's other policies where it really helps, but it's not worth politically that many people tuning out. So because I was trying to bring the parties together, I regrettably did not include immigration.
Heidi?
Well, I already said that I really liked the BLS investment, so I will also say the housing investment. And we have housing market failures that have led to acute shortages of affordable housing, so housing investments that was in the CAP plan was smart. And can I answer both questions? Because I also want to answer why we didn't put raising the retirement age in Social Security. And I think it's, everyone thinks of life expectancy as rising. It is not rising for all groups. Like if you look at life expectancy at age 50, it's the top quintile has seen big increases in life expectancy. The bottom quintile has actually seen declines, and around the middle, it's basically not that much different. And so raising the retirement age is simply a massive regressive benefit cut. And so that's the key reason we didn't include it.
I'm going to say something cool and fascinating about everybody's plan. I thought PPI's idea of tying Social Security benefits to the number of years worked instead of earnings levels is really interesting. I thought Brian actually already said the first one I was going to do from his plan was farm subsidies. I thought that was a really great idea. But another one I thought was really cool is lowering the payroll tax rate for seniors. That strikes me as a better way to encourage labor force participation among seniors. From EPIs, the one that I slapped my face that we didn't do was increasing SSI benefits. From the BPC's plan, I thought reducing the CTC phase-out levels makes a lot of sense. There's not that much political will to do it, but I think it makes a ton of sense. And without embracing President Biden's international reforms, coming up with a plan for OECD compliance, I thought was also really smart. I really liked how AEI took on ineffective retirement tax preferences. Love to see it. And what I thought was really brave in the American Action Farmers Plan is going back to the pre-TCJA tax rates. A lot of my criticisms about TCJA have to do with those rate reductions, just because we have some fiscal issues, didn't seem well timed. The arguments against it, not all of it, but a lot of those arguments, in my view, go away when you get rid of those rate cuts. So I thought that was a really smart idea for a right-of-center think tank to embrace.
That was a very bipartisan answer.
Yeah.
I should have let you go last.
I'm in the
but
middle,
we have-
Yeah.
So thank you, Brendan. But I'd love to give everyone else a chance. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And I can't top that, Brendan, but I will say, so I know Ben and PPI did this, and it's possible some other folks did this too. Thinking through like estate tax reform, and I think you all replaced it with an inheritance tax. There's just that part of the tax code is truly like Swiss cheese, and so I think you all were a little more creative and imaginative than we were on that. You could say you imagined what could be, unburdened by what has been. Good work.
Thanks. Jim?
I'll be on the positive side, which was I like the BPC education student loan plan. I think that's the right way to go. And so next time we'll put it in.
All right.
When
Maybe
debt to
we'll need it
GDP
next
is at
time.
150% of GDP, we'll be back with a plan to
Okay.
get it under control.
Jordan, you had the first word, so you get the last word.
Okay, I liked the AI proposal of lowering the corporate rate. I wish we had done something like that in our plan, incorporated that. My favorite proposal in our plan was actually raising the retirement age. I think that does a lot, not only to strengthen solvency of Social Security, but to improve, the financial wealth of seniors and their overall well-being. So I really liked that we included that.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you all. Please join me in giving a hand to this wonderful panel.